We didn't ease into that night at Truk. We were thrown into it, violently. The kind of battlefield where the horizon burns in every direction and radar screens feel like they're screaming. We remember the moment the alarms hit, sharp, metallic, the kind of sound that grabs your spine. Moments later, we saw it. A fast-moving Japanese destroyer cutting through the darkness, chasing a path directly toward the task force. And that was when the Iowa's secondary batteries woke up. We had seen naval gunfire before. We thought we understood what a 5-inch .38 caliber gun could do, but we had never seen them unleashed in full automatic sequence, guided by a Mark 37 fire control system locked so tightly on its target that it felt like the guns were thinking on their own. The first salvo illuminated the ocean like lightning, the second tore the night in half, and by the third, we realized there was no turning back. We were watching a destroyer get dismantled in real time. We remember the way the shells sounded, like tearing fabric crossed with thunder. Each projectile weighed nearly 55 pounds, leaving the barrels at more than 2,600 feet per second, heavy enough to smash steel, fast enough to outrun thought. The impacts were surreal. We saw sparks erupt along the destroyer's aft section. Then the hull began to deform, plates bending inward as if being punched by an invisible giant. The crew on the Iowa never hesitated. They fed the guns, corrected fire, tracked the target with cold mechanical precision. And then the sea changed color. It wasn't metaphorical, it wasn't poetic, it was real. The sailors on deck shouted it before we did. "The water's turning white." For a moment, none of us understood. Then we saw it, boiling wakes of shattered metal, wood, fuel and steam mixing into a pale, ghostly foam. Waves lit by fire. Mist shot upward from every impact crater the 5-inch guns carved into the water. It looked unreal, unnatural, like the ocean itself was recoiling. That was when we understood the truth. The Iowa's 5-inch guns weren't secondary weapons that night. They were the executioners. And a destroyer that had raced into the battle with confidence suddenly found itself trapped, torn apart piece by piece, surrounded by an ocean that seemed to glow with its own destruction. Before we take you straight into the chaos that erupted around Truk Lagoon, we need to ask one thing. From where are you watching this right now? Which city? Which state? Drop it in the comments because it's always incredible to see where these stories travel. Los Angeles, Houston, Miami. Maybe someone overseas watching from Germany, Canada, Australia. Let us know. And while you're there, hit the like button if the sheer power of American naval engineering already has your pulse up. It tells YouTube this kind of historical deep dive matters. And if you're not subscribed yet, now is the moment. We have more stories, massive ones, coming non-stop. Stories about firepower, innovation, courage, and the men who operated machines that reshaped entire oceans. Turn on notifications so you don't miss what comes next. Now let's go back to Truk, because things are about to get violent. We had been tracking enemy movements for hours before the destroyer showed itself. Truk was the kind of place where time felt stretched, where the air hung heavy with fuel vapors and distant explosions. We remember standing on the command deck, feeling every subtle vibration running through the Iowa's hull. Even before the firefight began, we could sense something was coming. Radar sweeps were picking up faint signatures cutting through the outer edges of the lagoon. Fast, aggressive, intent on slipping through the screens, protecting the battleships and carriers anchored nearby. The Iowa wasn't new to danger, but that night felt different. Everyone on watch shared the same tension, the same sharp, quiet focus that fills a warship when things are about to escalate. We heard reports relayed through the internal comms, unidentified surface contact approaching at over 30 knots. That was destroyer speed. Japanese destroyers were known for being quick, nimble, and vicious. Their Type 93 long-lance torpedoes were infamous, over 20 feet long, packed with more than 1,000 pounds of explosive, and capable of killing a battleship outright if they struck at the wrong angle. We watched officers move with purpose around the Combat Information Center. No panic, no hesitation, just steady, disciplined readiness. The kind of readiness the Navy drilled so deeply into crews that it became a reflex. Orders traveled fast. Secondary batteries to stand by, fire control radars to track the contact, starboard crews to their stations. The ship flexed and adjusted course with a sense of calm authority. We remember looking out over the dark ocean. There was almost no moon, just scattered reflections on the waves, and then cutting through the blackness we spotted it, a shadow slicing water apart, moving like it had somewhere to be. The Japanese destroyer wasn't backing off. It was closing distance. Hard. We remember the call. Mark 37 has solution, secondary batteries locked. That sentence alone carried weight. The Mark 37 fire control system wasn't some simple aiming tool. It was a fully integrated mechanical brain, a wartime computer using gyros, gears, and analog calculations to predict exactly where the target would be by the time the shells arrived. And when it locked with a kind of eerie precision. We knew then that if the destroyer kept coming, it was seconds away from facing something it couldn't outrun. The Iowa's 5-inch guns, 10 of them, mounted in twin turrets, weren't ornamental. Each turret weighed nearly 20 tons. Each round they fired weighed 55 pounds and left the barrel at more than half a mile per second. The guns were built for versatility, anti-air, anti-surface, shore bombardment. But in the hands of a well-trained crew, against a destroyer charging recklessly into range, they became something far more unforgiving. We saw the first muzzle flash from turret 52, a brilliant, violent burst that illuminated the deck. Before we could even exhale, the second turret answered, then the third. The rhythm became unmistakable. Recoil, flash, thunder, smoke, over and over, like the heartbeat of a steel giant coming fully alive. The air shook around us. Dust rattled loose from overhead beams. The ship vibrated not from fear but from fury, and in that first series of blasts we realized the destroyer had no idea what it had just walked into. It had stepped into a corridor of fire, a trap sprung by speed, skill, and American engineering working at full capacity, and all we could do was watch as the night around Truk began to tear itself apart. The second the first salvo hit the water near the destroyer, everything changed. We saw the ocean erupt in geysers taller than houses, lit from within by burning fragments of superheated steel. The radar operators confirmed we had bracketed the target. In naval terms, that meant it was only a matter of seconds before the shells stopped landing near the destroyer and started hitting it directly. We watched the destroyer begin evasive maneuvers, pivoting hard starboard in a desperate attempt to break the firing solution, but the Mark 37 tracked it like a predator. Every adjustment it made, the system compensated. Every shimmy or zigzag only tightened the Iowa's aim. We remember hearing the gun crews shouting loading commands, not frantic, but sharp and confident. Powder, shell, breech, locked, fire, over and over. The guns were operating at the edge of their mechanical limits. The crews, sweating despite the night air, fed them relentlessly. The Iowa wasn't just firing, it was attacking with intent. And then the first hit came. A bright flash exploded along the destroyer's stern. For a moment it almost looked like the ship had been yanked backward. The impact tore open plating and blew fragments into the sea. We saw flames burst from the aft deck, then dissipate as the ship accelerated again, still trying to run, still trying to get close enough to launch torpedoes. That was when the Iowa increased rate of fire. We've heard machine guns, we've heard heavy artillery, but the 5-inch guns firing at near maximum speed created something else, something between a drumroll and a storm. We felt it through the deck, through the bulkheads, through our chests. The ocean didn't just shake, it convulsed. The destroyer took another hit. This one struck midship, right along the superstructure. Sparks scattered like molten rain. The ship staggered to port, smoke trailing behind it. And then, unbelievably, it kept going. Japanese destroyers were built to be fast and resilient, but speed and resilience can only take so much punishment. The Iowa wasn't giving it seconds to breathe. More shells left the barrels. More impacts slammed into the hull. We saw sections of the destroyer collapse inward. We saw flames begin to spread along the deck. And yet, amid the chaos, the destroyer's crew fought to stay in the fight. We could see movement. Figures running along the starboard walkway, trying to man guns, trying to respond. But the 5-inch guns didn't allow heroics. Another salvo hit, this one closer to the bow. A blast of fire shot upward, followed by debris that arced into the black sky before plunging back into the white foaming water. The destroyer's forward momentum slowed. Not much, but enough for the fire control team to notice. Target slowing. Secondary batteries maintain fire. The voice over the speaker was calm, almost cold. Not out of cruelty, out of discipline, out of understanding of what had to happen, out of recognition that a destroyer at Truk, loaded with Type 93 torpedoes, could cripple or kill an American battleship if given even the slightest chance. We remember leaning forward, gripping the railing, watching the destroyer take hit after hit. It wasn't a simple battle anymore. It was a race between the destroyer's desperate charge and the Iowa's relentless firepower. And from the look of it, the destroyer was losing ground faster than anyone on it could comprehend. The destroyer tried to disappear behind a smokescreen. A thick, dark plume poured from its funnels and drifted across the water, an attempt to blind both the Iowa's optical directors and the radar operators. For a moment, we saw the outline blur, then fade. But the Mark 12 and Mark 22 radar sets didn't care. They cut straight through the smoke. We could see the operators adjusting dials, tightening the lock, refining the target's velocity and bearing. And then the guns spoke again. We saw the smoke cloud bloom with sparks as shells punched through it, some exploding on contact, others detonating milliseconds later. The ocean churned with each impact. The destroyer began to emerge from the haze, but its silhouette was wrong now. Bent, warped, missing pieces. The bow pitched lower than before. Water was pouring into compartments that were never meant to see the sea. We remember hearing the Iowa's engines hum louder as the ship adjusted speed to keep the chase angle perfect. Even from inside the steel hull, we felt the vibrations deepen. There was something terrifying about a battleship in motion, especially when it was hunting. It wasn't graceful. It wasn't subtle. It was inevitable. The destroyer attempted one last maneuver, a full-power turn to port, trying to angle its torpedo tubes toward the Iowa. We saw it coming the moment its bow carved a wide arc through the waves. Torpedoes weren't fired blindly. They needed a firing arc, and if the enemy destroyer got lined up, it could launch a spread so deadly that even the Iowa's armor couldn't guarantee survival. But the fire control computer had predicted this. Before the destroyer even completed the turn, the Iowa's guns fired a staggered, perfectly timed sequence, one turret, then another, then another. It wasn't random. It was calculated punishment. The first shell hit just above the waterline, tearing a crater into the hull large enough to swallow a jeep. The second struck near the bridge, sending a fireball upward. The third detonated near the torpedo mount. We saw it. Fragments of steel, wood, and deck plating blasted into the air. Torpedo tubes bent like paper. Flames shot sideways. Men were seen diving over the rails in desperation. For a moment, the destroyer vanished behind its own fireball. When the glow subsided, the ship was still afloat, but only barely. Its forward motion had collapsed. Its bow dipped dangerously low. The deck was at an unnatural angle, and yet it still hadn't sunk. Japanese damage control teams were some of the best in the world, and they were fighting to keep the vessel alive. But the Iowa didn't let up. Another salvo, another impact, another shockwave ripping through the water. We heard the Iowa's spotters shouting through the intercom, "Target losing structural integrity." Even from hundreds of yards away, we could see it. The destroyer's hull was beginning to buckle. Plates were pulling apart. Bulkheads were collapsing into each other. Flames licked out of wounds torn into the ship's frame. The vessel wasn't just damaged, it was unraveling. The crew on the Iowa continued their assault with surgical precision. Shell after shell punched deeper into the destroyer's weakening core. Every hit created more instability, more flooding, more chaos. The bow plunged further underwater until waves crashed across the deck with every roll. And that was when we felt it. A shift in the air, a tension in the ocean, like everything was coiling toward a single catastrophic end. We weren't watching a battle anymore. We were watching a destroyer being dismantled piece by piece, held together only by the stubbornness of its crew and the last fragments of its own steel skeleton. The sea around the destroyer began to change in ways we had never seen before. At first it was subtle, ripples turning irregular, foam forming in unnatural shapes. Then, gradually, the water took on a milky hue. We didn't understand it until the impacts increased. Every blast from the Iowa's 5-inch guns churned the ocean into violent plumes, mixing shockwaves with shrapnel, fuel, pulverized wood, scorched paint, and splintered steel. And then, it happened for real. The entire patch of ocean surrounding the destroyer turned white. Not light, not bright. White. A frothing, boiling, chaotic mixture of debris and steam. It looked like the surface of the sea had been scraped raw. The sailors around us shouted over the roaring guns, some in disbelief, others in pure adrenaline. We weren't exaggerating. The sea had changed color right before our eyes. We remember stepping toward the railing, bracing against the recoil of another volley. The night flashed again and again with every muzzle blast. Smoke rolled across the deck. The air tasted like burning cordite and oil. The destroyer staggered violently in the distance, almost unrecognizable under the weight of the bombardment. And still, the crew aboard that ship fought back. We saw tracers from their anti-aircraft mounts firing wildly, desperate, trying to hit anything. Spotters, searchlights, a miracle. The rounds arced harmlessly into the dark. The Iowa's armor barely registered the hits. The destroyer tried to accelerate, but its stern sagged deeper into the sea. Flooding was winning. The ship was losing power. Flames glowed beneath the torn sections of the hull like the heartbeat of a dying animal. Water sprayed upward as compartments failed one after another. The Iowa pressed forward. We heard the fire director call, "Maintain fire. Structural collapse imminent." The guns answered without hesitation. Another blast struck the destroyer near its remaining gun mounts. The entire structure seemed to lift, then slammed downward, as if punched by the ocean itself. Sparks rippled across the wrecked deck. We saw sections of the superstructure peel away, ripping into the water like molten metal. It was at that moment we realized we weren't just witnessing destruction. We were witnessing the absolute limit of what American naval firepower could do. The 5-inch guns weren't intended to annihilate large warships. They were multi-purpose weapons, defensive tools, support systems, and yet here they were, tearing apart a destroyer piece by piece, driven by precision fire control systems and crews trained to operate with machine-like discipline. The sea foamed harder. White water surged around the failing ship. Debris spread across the surface in waves. Parts of the destroyer were now missing. Entire sections where steel once held fast were gone, blown clear off. We could hear distant explosions echoing from deep inside the hull. Then the destroyer began to roll. Slowly at first, then faster. The bow dipped underwater as the stern lifted slightly, flames still flickering along the aft deck. We watched helplessly as men jumped from the listing vessel, vanishing into the churning white sea below. Their silhouettes flickered in the light of the fires. Their voices, if they shouted, were drowned out by the thunder of the Iowa's guns. And then, in one final violent heave, the destroyer lurched to port. The entire ship groaned, a deep metallic scream that cut through the battlefield. It twisted, collapsed inward, and began its descent beneath the waves. We stood there silent for a moment, not out of mercy, but out of awe at what we had just witnessed. A warship ripped open, beaten down and dragged into the depths by a combination of fire, force, and the unforgiving certainty of American naval engineering. The destroyer's final plunge wasn't quiet. It was violent, chaotic, like the ocean itself was trying to swallow the wreck before the fires above could consume it. As the bow vanished beneath the surface, a surge of displaced water erupted upward, sending debris spinning in every direction. What remained of the ship twisted unnaturally as the stern lifted, exposing mangled propellers and bent rudders that glimmered briefly under the firelit sky. We remember hearing the bulkheads implode as the ship sank deeper. The sound rolled across the water like distant thunder mixed with breaking bones. The destroyer was no longer fighting to stay afloat. It was being dragged downward by the overwhelming weight of flooding compartments, shattered machinery, and the brutal damage inflicted by the Iowa's guns. The ocean around the sinking wreck turned even whiter. Columns of bubbles shot to the surface, carrying splintered wood, torn steel, burned rope, even pieces of the deck that had been torn away by shell impacts. The 5-inch guns had done more than punch holes in the ship. They had destabilized its entire structure. We continued to watch, breath held, as the last visible parts of the destroyer slipped beneath the waves. Flames briefly clung to the water's surface before fizzling out. The roar of collapsing metal traveled upward through the sea, vibrating the Iowa's hull. And then, silence. Just the sound of churning water filling the void where a warship had stood minutes earlier. But the battle wasn't over for us. Our attention shifted to the survivors scattered across the surface, shadows bobbing among the foam, some motionless, others waving arms in desperation. Unlike other theaters of the war, battles near Truk were harsh. The Imperial Japanese Navy knew the Americans rarely risked recovery in hostile territory. The Iowa was under strict orders to maintain readiness. Rescue operations were nearly impossible this deep into enemy waters. We remember spotting officers on the bridge exchanging looks of conflict, duty versus instinct. But protocol ruled. We stayed the course. The mission had to continue. The Iowa could not afford to stop in waters still crawling with enemy submarines and aircraft. Still, we watched the survivors drift farther behind, swallowed by the night. The crew didn't celebrate. No cheering. No sense of triumph. This wasn't a movie moment. This was war. War in its rawest form. And even when the enemy had posed a lethal threat, even when firing was the only option, the aftermath carried weight. We felt it through the steel deck, through the night air, through the silence that followed the final impact. The sea gradually returned to its natural color, but the memory of that white boiling water stayed with us. It was the kind of sight you don't forget, the kind that etches itself into the back of your mind and resurfaces years later without warning. And yet, amid all the destruction, the Iowa continued forward, unshaken, unscarred, still ready to fight. The battleship represented something massive, something deeply American, superiority through precision, discipline, and overwhelming firepower. That night hadn't just demonstrated what the guns could do. It showcased what happens when technology, training, and resolve combine in perfect synchronization. But what came next would show us something even more profound, how a moment of quiet after devastation can feel heavier than the barrage itself, and how the sea never truly forgets what it swallows. As the Iowa resumed its patrol track, the tension didn't fade, it simply shifted. We were surrounded by the vastness of Truk Lagoon, a place that looked peaceful from a distance, but hid dangers beneath every ripple. Radar crews scanned constantly for new contacts. Lookouts swept the horizon, searching for any sign of torpedo wakes or aircraft silhouettes. The air carried the faint echoes of distant explosions from other engagements in the area. Inside the ship, the atmosphere felt different, not shaken, focused. The gun crews cleaned their barrels, wiped down breaches, rechecked gears and recoil systems. The Mark 37 team recalibrated, reviewing every detail of the engagement. Even after such a brutal display of firepower, discipline demanded they prepare for the next threat. And as we moved deeper into the lagoon, we could still see remnants of the previous fight drifting across the surface, charred planks, broken tools, shards of metal reflecting moonlight. Fragments of a warship that had challenged an American battleship and lost spectacularly. The ocean was calm again, but the evidence of what had happened floated like ghosts. We remember hearing a machinist's mate speaking quietly with another sailor near the starboard walkway. No excitement, no bravado, just a sober acknowledgement of what they had seen. I never thought 5-inch guns could do that. Not like that. Another crewman nodded in agreement. None of us had expected it either. We had always known the Iowa's secondary battery was powerful. But witnessing its full potential unleashed, seeing it tear through a destroyer's structural integrity, left an impression we couldn't shake. Reports from other vessels in the task force began filtering in. Carriers had launched strikes. Cruisers were engaging smaller ships. Submarines lurked somewhere beneath us. The entire operation at Truk was unfolding in a violent, coordinated symphony of American naval dominance. And the Iowa was right at the center of it. We remember passing through the ship's interior afterward, feeling the low hum of engines and the rhythmic pulse of massive turbines. The Iowa wasn't just a battleship, it was a living machine, every compartment working in harmony. Electricians adjusting circuits, boiler technicians monitoring temperatures, signalmen tapping coded messages, Every sailor ensured the ship stayed ready for whatever came next. Outside, the sky began to lighten slightly. Not sunrise, just the faint glow of burning oil from distant wrecks reflecting upward. The lagoon smelled of fuel and gunpowder, a reminder that this operation wasn't finished. Then came the call through the intercom. All stations stand by, possible additional surface contact. The crew returned to stations instantly. No hesitation, no questions. We felt the ship adjust course again, engines spooling in a deep mechanical rumble. The gun crews reloaded, checked sights, wiped sweat from their faces. The Mark 37 locked into scanning mode, servos humming quietly as the director rotated. Minutes passed. The radar contact vanished, likely debris or a drifting wreck misread by surface clutter. But those minutes said everything about life aboard a wartime battleship. You were always seconds away from another fight, always one radar blip from another life or death engagement. And as the Iowa pushed forward into the lagoon, the memory of the destroyer still sinking behind us, we realized something. The battle had shown not just what the ship could do, but who we were as a crew. Focused, relentless, wired into the rhythm of one of the most powerful machines ever put to sea. We continued across Truk with full awareness that every mile carried risks. But we also carried something else, the certainty that if another enemy ship appeared, the Iowa would be ready. And after what we had witnessed, we knew exactly what those 5-inch guns were capable of. As the calm finally settled over Truk Lagoon, we found ourselves looking back at the foam, the debris, and the fading glow of distant fires. We had witnessed destruction on a scale that only naval combat can produce. Steel bent, hulls shattered, the sea turned white by sheer force. And through it all the Iowa stood unshaken, its guns ready, its crew steady, its purpose unbroken. These moments reminded us why ships like the Iowa existed, not for intimidation, not for spectacle, but to protect fleets, safeguard allies, and end threats before they reached American shores. The 5-inch guns were called secondary, but that night they proved themselves decisive, an example of American engineering pushed to its absolute limit. And we never forget the people behind those guns, the loaders, the gunners, the spotters, the engineers keeping turbines spinning. Every one of them contributed to the precision and power that stopped an enemy destroyer dead in the water. To the men who served, to the ships that carried them, and to the equipment that defined a generation of naval warfare, we owe them more than memory. We owe them respect, gratitude, and the commitment to keep their stories alive.